Welcome back to the Helicon studio here at Blockchain World DCS 2021. I'm Natalie Brunell. Our next speaker is Brett King. He is a futurist, a best-selling author, an award-winning speaker, hosts a globally recognized radio show, and he's going to be talking about his newest book, Technosocialism. Welcome, Brett.
Welcome. Today we're going to talk about the future. The 21st century is going to be a period of incredible and intense change. The 21st century is going to be the most disruptive, contentious period humanity's ever lived through. It's going to challenge many of our sacred ideologies, particularly around areas like economics, politics, social constructs, because the rate of change that technology is thrusting upon us in the 21st century is like nothing humanity has ever lived through before. But it's not just technology change, it's also the fact that we are going to have to cope with some of the most significant crises in the history of humanity. What do I mean by that? Well, we are in the midst, coming out of, hopefully, a pandemic, a one in 100-year event. Yes, we had the Spanish flu back in the 20th century, but today, with almost 8 billion people on the planet, the pandemic has obviously been much more disruptive. It may not be the last pandemic we face over the next couple of decades. As climate change impacts the world, as we start to see glacial melt, maybe more primordial pandemics or viruses may be released into the wild. But we live in a time of great upheaval from a technology perspective, and one of the side effects of this is that it has created great economic uncertainty. How do we measure this? Well, look at the United States today as an example. It's the world's largest economy, and we measure that in terms of things like, the economists use terms like GDP growth or employment, unemployment figures, trade surpluses, and things like that. And by this measure, the United States, particularly the post-Second World War United States economy, is the most successful economy the world has ever seen. But during the pandemic, the world's billionaires surpassed $10 trillion of wealth for the first time. That's a big number, right? The crypto industry is about $3 trillion, but all of the world's billionaires today own more wealth than about half of the world's population. In the United States, it's even worse. Just 0.1% of the US population own more wealth than the bottom 90%. Now, if you know your history books, this level of economic inequality normally is a precursor for revolutionary change, at least for redistribution of wealth. This level of disparity between rich and poor is largely unsustainable. Now, how do we know this is already having an effect? If you've been watching over the last few years, think back, for example, to the protests we've seen around governmental response to climate change, or the protests that occurred when Trump was elected president in the United States, or the protests in Hong Kong, for example, the umbrella protests in Hong Kong. In the first 20 years of the 20th century, we've seen basically double the number of protests that we saw in the entire 20th century. But the participation in those protests has gone up 1,000%. This is expression of the fact that people are feeling uncertain about what's going to happen in the future. In the US, they had this thing called the American Dream. You've probably heard of this concept. And the concept was that if you worked hard and you came to the United States and worked hard as an immigrant, that your children would be better off than you. They would have a positive future. But that's really no longer the case. the economy stopped really functioning like that for most Americans in the 1980s. If you, again, know your history, we've seen economic changes before, but think about what made the economy successful in the US post-Second World War. There was a number of things that sort of all came together. After the Second World War, there had been austerity, so people were saving. And all of that pent-up demand came out in the US economy as consumption. People buying new homes, buying new electronic gadgets for the first time as they became available. And this created an electronics boom, for example, in the United States economy. In the 1960s, the US accounted for 40% of all global output. But there was also strong investment in infrastructure, wages were growing. All of this created a huge amount of economic activity that led to the largest growth in the middle class that we've ever seen in history. At least historically up until recently, because China is now starting to surpass the US. But this middle class growth was very good for the economy of the United States. It created massive economic activity. Now, historically, when we look at the way economies work, the model of economies, or sort of socio-political economic organizing principles, tend to be very different historically than what we saw after the Second World War in the United States. There's a historian called Will Durant. Will and Ariel Durant wrote a book in the 1960s called Lessons from History. And it looked at all of these different economic and political systems that we'd had in the past. And they observed that there was sort of two basic systems at play. Historically, the most common form of governance or organizing principles for society was a pyramid-shaped model. Now, governments or power bases that act as a pyramid-shaped model where the wealthy elite control the means of production or control the assets of the economy are designed where the poorest are workers working for the landlords, working for the landowners and the wealthy, where the wealth flows uphill. So monarchies and these types of systems were really designed to create wealth for that upper class. But the United States post-Second World War was a diamond-shaped economy. And so this diamond-shaped economy meant that wealth was distributed evenly between the richest and the poorest. This is what really contributed to this incredible growth of the middle class in the United States. But in the 1980s, late 1970s, early 1980s, you start to have the wealthy elite in the United States and in the United Kingdom wanting to push that diamond shape back to a pyramid-shaped model. What Will and Ariel Durant found was that these diamond-shaped economies, which are extremely successful, tend to be unstable. So in the 1980s in the UK, you have Thatcher, and you have this movement to suppress trade unions who are seen as the enemy of the people because of the problems of the functioning economy in the UK. You have Reagan in the United States attacking trade unions at the same time. So with the pressure coming on trade unions, you remove collective bargaining, and what this means is that wages started to stall. So since the 1980s in the United States and in the UK, basically wage growth has been flat. That means that people have been getting paid the same salary for the last 40 years, effectively, for doing the same job. But the prices have continued to go up. The prices of homes, the price of food, the price of gas or fuel has gone up. And so, if you're in this economy where you can no longer bargain to get wage increases, your dollars don't go as far as they used to in the past. A second thing happened when Bill Clinton came to power. This sort of started with Nixon to some extent removing the gold standard, but Clinton came and deregulated financial services. So now you have all these new mechanisms for creating wealth for the wealthy elite through the stock exchange and through stock markets in a different way from what had been possible before. So the US goes from this bell curve with a growing middle class and wealth distributed evenly throughout the economy to now flattening the economy back into a pyramid-shaped model. And then the US economy slows. The GDP growth that we saw in the 1960s and the 1950s, 6, 7, 8%, goes down to 1 and 2 and 3%. And then you have China. China starts to open up their economy in the 1980s. And this opening up of the Chinese economy and this growth in consumption in the Chinese economy creates a rapidly growing middle class. China goes from a pyramid-shaped model to a diamond-shaped model. So this is sort of what's happened on a geopolitical basis. And the middle class growth that we're seeing in China today, plus the fact that they're creating things like the Belt and Road Initiative, this infrastructure investment they're making, this is really what's going to mean that China surpasses the United States as the world's most powerful economy in the next decade. How's the United States going to cope with all of that? You know, the US views itself as the most successful economy in the world. It views itself as the most powerful nation in the world because of its economic power and, to some extent, its military power. But China is challenging that. Where do we fit in all of this? Well, the next disruptive crises that we're going to face, two major crises, apart from the issue of inequality and this gap between the rich and the poor and the pandemics that we've already faced, the two big issues as a human species we're going to have to cope with is the emergence of artificial intelligence and the effects of climate change. About 50% of the jobs that exist in the UAE economy today are going to be automated through the use of robotic process automation and artificial intelligence. In the United States, it's very similar, about 50 to 60% of jobs. In China, it's even more because a lot of the jobs in the factories will be eliminated. AI is really designed to eliminate humans from the workforce. If AI is ultimately successful, it means we won't have to work. But think about our value today. You come to an event like this and you meet someone, what do you normally ask them? You ask them their name, do you live here? And then what do you do? Our work in many ways defines us. But AI, if it's successful, will eliminate humans from the workforce. So how's that going to change the way we work? By 2035, we're going to have a very interesting conflict in terms of employment. We're going to have large-scale unemployment because of automation, but we're also going to have labor shortages because there's not enough technology skills or STEM jobs in the economy. China's doing really well in terms of preparing their population for these changes. They're focused on artificial intelligence at a grade school level, teaching their children to work with robots. Japan's also been doing this for many years. But in the US, there's sort of this, as we've seen it particularly in recent times, some people that don't think technology is not good, that they don't trust the science anymore. This conflict around technology is going to get worse, obviously, as unemployment is impacted, as techno-unemployment emerges. So what do we do about this? Well, we are coming into a period, because of artificial intelligence, where incredible wealth is going to be generated. But that wealth is probably going to be generated by the companies that own artificial intelligence and technology. 9 out of 10 of the top companies in the world today are technology companies. The only one company in the world that in the top 10 that's not a technology company is Saudi Aramco. But you've got Apple and Microsoft, Alibaba, Amazon, all of these players in the top 10 companies in the world today. And they employ much smaller number of people to generate the sort of profits and returns that they do than, say, the biggest companies in the world in the 1960s and 1970s. Because the market values productivity. It values improvements in generating returns and profit that technology affords. So the market's not going to say, wait, stop with all this technology and AI because people are going to lose their jobs. The market's not going to do that because the market wants that market activity. So what are we going to do about people that lose their jobs because of robotics and automation? This is why you hear people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Richard Branson and these technologists talking about universal basic income. Universal basic income would be where the economy pays you as a citizen just for being a part of the economy. And this is a very important feature of 21st century economies. Asking the question is, what is an economy for? You know, economists used to measure it by all those measures we talked about before, GDP growth and so forth. But if an economy can't meet the basic needs of its citizens, if there's homeless people on the streets, if people can't afford enough food to eat, if they can't have access to basic health care, then you could argue this is a failure of the economy to provide for the citizens. Today, economies work for an increasingly small number of citizens, the richest of the economy. In the 21st century, this is going to have to change. We're going to have to find ways for the economy to make sure everyone is looked after, especially if artificial intelligence disrupts employment. But then we have climate change, and that's going to be an even bigger challenge. By 2050, 570 of the world's coastal cities will be affected by sea level rise. Food scarcity is going to be a problem as the warming temperatures change farming patterns in the world. This means that we could be dealing with anywhere between 300 million and 1 billion eco-refugees. That problem is almost too big to comprehend. And in classic economic terms, if you believe in pure capitalism, the market doesn't have a mechanism to solve that problem. The market isn't incentivized to fix that problem. So we need a different economic philosophy. We need really a different philosophy for humanity. What is optimal humanity? How, as a species, are we going to survive these crises and these disruptive elements? Well, again, history teaches us a lesson. Humans are at our best when we work together, when we cooperate. And you can see this in, say, the Apollo project, the Human Genome Project, or even more recently in the way we responded to coronavirus with production of vaccines and so forth. To solve these problems that we face, humanity is going to have to come together. These things that divide us, the patch of dirt you were born on, or which economic philosophy you attribute to, or what sort of education you have, or what skin color you share. These are abstractions. These are things that keep us divided. But the problems that we face in the 21st century are too big for humans to stay divided. We have to work together. We can't have 1 billion eco-refugees and just leave them to it. We have to find a way as humanity to come together. And when we get through the other side of this, then there's nothing we won't be able to achieve. We'll be able to extend human life. We'll be able to live longer lives. We'll become a multi-planetary species. When we work in the 21st century, by the middle of this century, the work that we do won't be work that we have to do to put food on the table. It'll be things that we're passionate about, things that will make a difference, like fixing the problems associated with climate change, things that really will matter for future generations, for our children and our grandchildren. There are 4 potential futures that humanity faces. One is where we reject technology. We call this the ladder stand scenario. One is where we just waited too long to fix the problems. We call this fail to stand. In the United States today, we have this growing movement towards neo-feudalism, increasing this gap between the rich and the poor. But the optimal form of humanity for the future, we argue in our new book, is called Technosocialism. It's a collective view of technology, where technology is used for the good of all humans to provide the best quality of life possible for all of us. And that's what technology can do if we just have the will as a human species to deploy that technology for the benefit of everyone. and not just a small group of people. That's the future that we have to choose, potentially, or that we can choose ourselves. Optimal humanity, which we call the rise of technosocialism. Thank you very much for your time today.